The morning they put my performance file on the shared screen during a team briefing, I remember thinking how strange it was that 12 years of work could be made to look so small when compressed into a single slide. My name was there in plain font. Beside it, my salary, my contract tier, and a column labeled Market Competitiveness Index. The number in that column was red. I had never seen my name in red before. The man who had put it there was our new regional director, brought in 6 weeks earlier from a consultancy firm in Sydney. His name was Calloway, and he had the particular confidence of someone who had never once had to earn trust slowly. He spoke in the language of restructures and optimization cycles, and he wore his certainty the way some people wear expensive suits as a substitute for substance. I was 29 years old. I had been at Meridian Logistics Solutions since I was 17, first as a part-time freight coordinator while finishing school in Christchurch, then full-time, then senior account manager, then head of strategic partnerships for the South Island. 12 years. Not because I lacked options, but because I genuinely believed in what we were building. That morning, Brett looked at my name on the screen, then looked at me, and said my compensation sat 38% above the market median for my role classification. He said it the way someone might read out a weather forecast neutrally, as if the fact of it excused the manner of delivering it. 14 people were in that room. My colleagues, people I had trained, covered for, celebrated with. Not one of them said a word. I kept my hands flat on the table and breathed slowly. What Brett did not know, because he had never asked, was that I personally managed the accounts that represented 51% of Meridian's South Island revenue. He did not know that 3 of our largest clients had signed multi-year renewals specifically because of relationships I had built over the better part of a decade. He did not know that when the Port of Littleton freight delays nearly cost us the Hargreaves contract 2 years earlier, I had driven to the client's warehouse at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning and stood on the floor with their operations manager until we had a solution. He did not know any of that because none of it appeared on his spreadsheet. What appeared on his spreadsheet was a number in red, and he had decided that was enough to know. I want to tell you how I got to that room, because the context matters. When I joined Meridian at 17, the South Island operation was modest, a regional office, with about 40 staff, mostly focused on domestic freight. My first job was answering phones and updating delivery manifests. It was unglamorous work, and I loved it. I loved the logic of it, the way every problem had a physical solution somewhere in the chain, the way a good call at the right moment could stop a cascade of delays before anyone upstream even knew there had been a risk. By the time I was 22, I was handling escalations that were supposed to go to managers twice my age. Not because I pushed for it, but because I was usually the one who had already started solving the problem while others were still deciding who should own it. The clients noticed. That is the part people in head office always underestimated about regional logistics. In Auckland, you might win business through brand reputation and volume pricing. In Christchurch, you win it through familiarity, through showing up, through being the person who calls before there is a problem rather than after. I became that person, not strategically, not as a career move, but because it was simply how I worked. I kept notes on every client's operational quirks. I knew which transport managers had young families and worked better with morning calls, which procurement leads were under board pressure and needed data before they could approve anything, which operations directors had been burned by a supplier before and needed an extra layer of reassurance before they would extend a contract. None of that was in any job description. It was just the texture of the work. By the time I was 26, I was managing accounts worth roughly $40 million annually in contract value, not because the company had formally given me that responsibility, but because the clients had quietly consolidated their contact point to me. They trusted me. In a relationship-driven industry, trust is not a soft metric. It is the actual infrastructure. When Meridian's regional growth started accelerating, there were internal celebrations, emails from the Auckland head office with phrases like outstanding regional performance and exceptional retention rates. I read those emails between reviewing renewal schedules for the following quarter, and I felt proud, even knowing that the numbers in those emails had not appeared by themselves. Then, Brett arrived. He came in with a mandate from Auckland to right-size the South Island cost structure. Within his first 2 weeks, he had requested compensation data for the entire team, begun circulating internal benchmarking reports, comparing our salaries to industry averages, and started using the phrase lean and fit for purpose in almost every conversation. The first time he came to my office, he looked at the wall where I keep some notes from clients' handwritten thank you cards, a photo from a site visit at a cold storage facility in Timaru, a small certificate from a regional business awards night, and he asked whether I found that kind of thing motivating. I said yes. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they are forming an opinion they have not shared yet. He called me a relationship person, and something in the way he said it made the phrase feel like a diagnosis rather than a compliment, as though being good with people was a charming but economically inefficient quality, like having a nice handwriting in a digital age. I understood then that he had already decided what I was, and that his decision had been made without reference to what I actually produced. The weeks that followed were uncomfortable in the way that only a workplace can make uncomfortable the specific dread of an environment turning hostile without anyone acknowledging it openly. Anonymous salary comparison documents began appearing in shared drives. Performance calibration meetings were scheduled without full team notice. People began editing what they said in group conversations, trimming their sentences of anything that might draw attention. I watched it all, and I felt something I had not felt at work before. The particular loneliness of being the most visible target in a room full of people, too frightened to look at you directly. Brett's internal newsletter, he had already started sending one. 6 weeks in, was titled, Building for Tomorrow. It contained language about performance cultures and cost discipline, and near the end, a paragraph about ensuring compensation reflected current market realities and role-specific value delivery. I read that sentence 4 times. I knew it was about me, and I suspected most of the team did too. The morning of the briefing, I arrived early. I had a coffee from the place on Colombo Street that I had been going to since I was a trainee, and I sat at the table and waited, not knowing what was coming. When Brett's first slide appeared, and my name was on it, I felt the heat in my face and the absolute stillness that comes when shock and clarity arrive at exactly the same moment. He pointed at the red number and said my compensation created an internal equity issue and needed to be brought into alignment with the market rate for my role classification. He proposed a revised package, a 29% reduction in base salary, removal of my vehicle allowance, and restructuring of my performance bonus to a model that would, in practice, make it nearly impossible to achieve. Someone near the window shifted in their chair. I heard a pen click twice. I looked at Brett directly and said that a conversation about my compensation would be better suited to a private setting. He smiled in the way people smile when they want to appear reasonable while doing something unreasonable, and said this was a team-wide transparency exercise. He said the company was committed to fair and open performance management. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, very quietly, that the accounts I personally managed represented over 50% of the South Island revenue, and that the proposed saving on my compensation was equivalent to less than 0.5% of the value I administered in a single quarter. The room went so still that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen 2 doors down. Brett had no meaningful answer, because he had constructed his entire argument on benchmarking data that compared my job title to a national average, without any reference to what the job actually produced. He had reduced me to a classification. He had never once asked what the classification was responsible for holding together. I sat through the rest of the meeting without speaking again. When it ended, I walked back to my desk, closed my door, and sat in the chair where I had spent more hours than I could count, thinking clearly about what had just happened and what it meant. On my desk was a card from Diane Hewitt, the general manager at Hargreaves Distribution, sent after we resolved the Littleton situation. It said, simply, I don't know what we'd do without you. There was a photograph of me and the operations team at a client Christmas function, everyone laughing, everyone relaxed, the kind of photograph that only exists because the working relationship underneath it is genuinely good. I looked at those things and understood that my professional life had never lived in Brett's slide. It lived in those moments, in the trust that had been built over years, carefully, in the gaps between what contracts could specify and what relationships could sustain. I opened my laptop. I went to a folder. I kept labeled Future, not because I planned to use it, but because I had always believed in staying informed. There were 3 emails in there, all from the previous 18 months, all from companies that had reached out after clients or industry contacts had mentioned my name. The most recent was from a woman named Renata Solomona, head of commercial partnerships at a freight forwarding company called Calloway Freight Group, operating out of Wellington with a strong South Island presence. She had written 8 months earlier to say she had heard I had a rare ability to hold client relationships through difficult operational periods, and that if I was ever open to a conversation, she would very much like to have one. I had politely declined at the time, citing my commitment to my current role. Reading her email again that afternoon, I noticed how much had changed in 8 months, and how little of that change had been my choice. I began writing my resignation letter with the kind of calm that surprised me. There was no anger in it, no accusation. I wrote that following that day's compensation discussion, I had determined that my professional goals and the company's current direction were no longer aligned, and that I was resigning effective immediately. I thanked the company for the 12 years of development opportunity and wished the team well. Every sentence was professional. Every word was chosen. And underneath the professionalism was something irreversible, a door that I was closing, not in rage, but in the quiet certainty that it needed to be closed. I sent it to Brett, to the HR manager in Auckland, and to the regional director above Brett. Then I packed the things from my desk that belonged to me, the cards, the photograph, a small plant I had brought from home 3 years earlier, and a notebook full of client process notes that were entirely my own work. No one came to my office. People in the open area found reasons to look at their screens as I walked past. I understood it. I had felt the same fear in that room earlier, the instinct to make yourself small when someone dangerous has power. I did not resent it, but I also did not mistake it for something it was not. At 4:45, I was sitting in my car on Durham Street, watching the late afternoon light come off the Avon. My phone rang. It was Renata Solomona. Her voice was calm and direct. She said she had heard something had happened at Meridian today, and she wanted me to know that her offer from 8 months ago remained entirely open. She said Calloway had been watching Meridian's South Island performance for a while, and they had noticed something. The company's own leadership apparently had. Not that the performance, and the person who built it, were not separate things. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Come to Wellington on Monday. We'll have a proper conversation." I told her I would be there. That night, I sat at my kitchen table in Addington with a cup of tea, and I did not feel defeated. I felt strangely light, the way you feel after carrying something heavy for a long time and finally putting it down, not because you were forced to, but because you understood it was time. By Friday morning, the news had moved through the industry faster than I expected. Freight and logistics in New Zealand is a small world. People talk. By mid-morning, my phone had received 7 messages, 2 of which were from clients. The first client call was from Stuart Nawakamawi, General Manager of Coastal Supply Chain Partners, one of Meridian's longest-standing accounts, 12 years, same as me. His voice was careful and quiet when he asked if it was true that I had resigned. I told him it was. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that he hoped I knew his company had always done business with me personally, not with a brand. He said he would need to have a conversation with his board about contract continuity before the current agreement came up for renewal. I reminded him, gently, that I was not in a position to solicit clients or discuss business transitions under my exit terms. He gave a short, dry laugh and said he understood that entirely. He just wanted me to know where things stood from his side. I thanked him and ended the call. The second client call was longer and more direct. By Saturday evening, I had received contact from 9 separate accounts. I did not respond to any of them substantively, not because I was cold, and not because I wanted to escalate the situation, but because I knew the shape of what was happening did not require my participation to continue. When trust has a face, and that face is no longer attached to an organization, the clients do not need to be told what to do. They already know. On Sunday, I posted a brief message on LinkedIn. I said I was grateful for 12 years of growth and learning, that I was proud of the relationships and outcomes I had been part of, and that I was excited about a new chapter in South Island freight and logistics. I did not mention Brett. I did not describe the briefing. I did not need to. Within a few hours, the post had been shared widely enough that former clients, industry contacts, and several journalists covering the New Zealand freight sector had seen it. A few people commented publicly that Meridian had made a significant strategic misstep. One industry figure wrote that this was a textbook example of confusing cost reduction with value destruction. That evening, Renata texted to say that two of Meridian's clients had already made enquiries to Tawiri about contract capacity. I set my phone face down on the bench and made another cup of tea. Monday came the way consequential days always seem to quietly, without announcing what they are carrying. I drove to Wellington and met Renata at Tawiri's offices near the waterfront. She was practical, warm, and precise in the way that people who have built something real tend to be. She did not waste time on ceremony. Within 90 minutes, she had walked me through a role, head of South Island Client Strategy, with a salary that was 42% higher than what Meridian had proposed in Brett's revised package, full operational autonomy over my team structure, and a clear mandate to build something lasting. I signed the contract before lunch. On the drive back to Christchurch, I received an email from Brett. He wrote that Meridian was experiencing unexpected client communication activity and that he believed it was important we have a conversation about transition responsibilities. He asked if I would be willing to assist with account handover communications. I read the email while parked at a rest stop south of Palmerston North, with the Manawatu Gorge visible through the passenger window. I thought about the 14 people in that room on Thursday morning. I thought about the red number on the screen. I thought about 12 years of 6 a.m. calls and airport departures and conversations that kept contracts alive through problems that never appeared in any benchmarking report. Then I replied, very simply, that I had been informed my compensation was 38% above market value, and I trusted the person hired at market rate would be well equipped to manage the transition. I did not hear back from Brett that day. By Tuesday afternoon, the scale of what was unfolding had become visible in industry conversation. 11 contracts had notified Meridian of review intentions, not cancellations reviews. But in freight and logistics, a contract review initiated by a client is rarely a formality. It is a signal. And when 11 signals appear in 48 hours, the message is not subtle. A former colleague sent me a message saying the Auckland head office had held an emergency call with the South Island leadership team and that Brett had presented a client retention strategy consisting primarily of competitive repricing and outreach calls. The calls were not going well. Clients who had spent years talking to me were now being contacted by account managers they had never spoken to, offering discounts on services they had never complained about. Several clients responded by accelerating their reviews. By the end of that first week, 14 accounts had formally initiated contract reviews, and 3 had already submitted termination notices. The combined annual value of those 3 contracts alone was just over $18 million. Brett's proposed saving on my compensation had been roughly $32,000 per year. I did not post about it. I did not speak to journalists. I let the numbers speak in the only language that matters to a company's leadership, the one that appears in the revenue column. On the Thursday of my second week at Tawiri, Brett called my mobile directly. I had not expected it. His voice was different from the voice that had narrated my salary to a room full of colleagues quieter, stripped of the consultant's cadence. He said the company was in a difficult position and that he genuinely believed my involvement in a structured transition would benefit everyone, including the staff who remained. I listened to all of it. There was a time, not long ago, when a call like that would have sent me straight into problem-solving mode. 12 years of being the person who holds things together does something to your instincts. When something starts to fall, you reach for it automatically. But that afternoon, standing in the Tawiri car park with the Wellington wind coming off the harbor, I realized I had already reached for it. 12 years of reaching for it, of being the infrastructure that kept a building upright while it considered whether the infrastructure was worth keeping. I told Brett, without rancor, that I wished the company well, but that I was fully committed to my new role and unable to assist with Meridian's internal transition. I told him I hoped the team would be supported through whatever came next. He tried once more. He used the word loyalty. I let a pause sit between us before I responded. Then I said that loyalty was exactly what had kept me at Meridian for 12 years, and that the decision made in that briefing room on Thursday morning had been the company's statement about how it valued that loyalty. I said I had simply taken the statement seriously. I ended the call and stood there for a moment in the wind, feeling the particular stillness of someone who has said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. The following weeks at Meridian were reported through industry channels rather than any direct communication. 17 contracts had now entered formal review. 4 had terminated. The head office dispatched a senior executive from Auckland to manage the situation, which had by then become visible enough that 2 freight industry publications had run short pieces about client movement away from Meridian's South Island operation. The official statements used phrases like routine portfolio realignment and strategic account review. The industry read it accurately. So did the clients. At Calloway, my onboarding was quiet and purposeful. Renata gave me time and space, and the specific kind of trust that comes from hiring someone because you understand what they actually do, rather than what their job title implies. My first priority was stabilizing the new accounts that had come across, not pursuing them, not soliciting them, but being present and consistent for the clients who had chosen to move and needed to know the choice had been the right one. Within my first month, Calloway had formalized new contracts with 8 companies that had previously been Meridian accounts. The combined value was close to $34 million annually. Renata told the board it was the strongest new business acquisition in the company's South Island history. She said it with a straight face, which I appreciated, because we both understood it was not really new business. It was relationships that had simply found a new home. The final number, when it settled, was this. In the 8 months following that Thursday briefing, Meridian's South Island revenue declined by 44%. 3 rounds of redundancies followed. Brett Calloway was removed from his role by the end of the second quarter. The official company statement described it as a leadership restructure following a period of strategic review. I read it over a coffee in my new office in Addington, Calloway, had opened a South Island base with the harbor photograph I had brought from my old desk sitting on the windowsill. I felt no triumph. I want to be honest about that. I felt sadness for the colleagues who lost their jobs. Good people who had been frightened into silence in a room and paid a price they had not created. I felt something like grief for the version of Meridian that had existed before Brett arrived with his benchmarking reports. The company I had given 12 years to because I believed in it, but I did not feel regret about leaving. Not for a moment. Because if I had stayed, if I had accepted the revised package, and swallowed the humiliation of being reduced in public, I would have taught everyone watching Brett, my colleagues, myself, that the way I had been treated was acceptable, and it was not. The price of staying would have been something that no salary adjustment could compensate for. It would have been my own sense of what I was worth. 6 months into my role at Calloway, Renata gave me the autonomy to build my team from scratch. 4 people, all chosen for the same reason. Not because their CVs were impressive, but because they understood that in a relationship-driven industry, the work that matters most rarely appears in a performance report. We built something that functioned differently from how I had worked at Meridian, not because Meridian was wrong in principle, but because Calloway understood that the model only works if the people in it are trusted, compensated fairly, and never made to feel that their value is something leadership gets to determine without reference to what they actually produce. At the 1-year mark, our South Island portfolio had grown to over $60 million in managed contract value. Industry contacts who had watched the whole sequence play out sent quiet, understated messages of the kind that New Zealanders tend to send, nothing effusive, just a line or two, saying they were glad things had worked out. One of them was from Diane Hewitt at Hargreaves, who wrote, "You were always the reason that partnership worked. Good to see that recognized properly." I printed it and added it to the wall. A year after I left Meridian, a business school case study was published examining what the author described as a regional cost-cutting decision that destroyed 4 times its intended saving in revenue within a single financial year. The company was not named, but the freight industry is small, and the details were recognizable to anyone paying attention. My name was not in the study. I did not need it to be. What I kept from all of it, what I carry forward, is not the satisfaction of having been proven right. It is something quieter and more durable. It is the understanding that your value does not live in someone else's benchmark. It lives in what you build, what you protect, and what follows you when you leave a place that stopped seeing clearly. There is something I want to say directly to anyone watching this who has felt the particular exhaustion of working somewhere that treats your loyalty as a given and your worth as negotiable. You are not a line item. You are not a percentage above or below a median. The work you do that cannot be measured, the relationships held together, the problems solved before anyone noticed they existed, the trust maintained through difficulty, that work is not invisible because it lacks value. It is invisible because the people who benefit from it most often understand it least. The most important thing I learned through all of this is not how to leave well, though that matters. It is how to know, clearly and without self-deception, what you have actually built. When you know that, genuinely know it, then no one can take it from you by projecting a number in red onto a screen and calling it a transparency exercise. Know what you carry, know what follows you, and know that silence, sometimes, is not weakness. Sometimes, silence is simply you standing still, while the truth arranges itself into something everyone can finally see. If you are in a workplace where your contribution is regularly reduced to a metric, ask yourself this: not whether the metric is fair, but whether the people holding the metric understand what the number is sitting on top of. Because numbers do not float. They rest on something. And when you remove the thing underneath without understanding what it is, the number does not stay where it was. It falls. Look clearly at what you have built. Protect your dignity as carefully as you protect your work. And remember that a company which needs to humiliate you in order to manage you has already told you everything you need to know about whether it deserves to keep you. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today.